Bienvenidos a Tres Respuestas, un espacio de opinión, de discusión y de propuestas. Hoy estamos desde la ciudad de Washington, D.C. Estamos en el Centro Iván Duque para la Libertad y la Prosperidad dentro del Woodrow Wilson Center y tenemos un invitado muy especial. Se trata del embajador Mark Green, presidente y CEO del Woodrow Wilson Center, el think tank quizás más prestigioso que tiene la ciudad de Washington, creado por el Congreso de los Estados Unidos para llevar la memoria del presidente Woodrow Wilson. Es un centro independiente, bipartidista y algo muy importante, muy influyente en la definición de la política exterior de los Estados Unidos. Pero además de eso, el embajador Mark Green se ha desempeñado como administrador, como gerente y director de la Agencia de Cooperación de los Estados Unidos. Ha sido también director del Instituto Internacional Republicano, ha sido también director del Instituto John McCain, fue también embajador en Tanzania y ha sido un gran amigo de Colombia. Mark, it's such a pleasure to have you in Tres Respuestas.
Oh, it's great to be with you. It's great to be with you.
Well, this is for me an honor, and it's so great to having this podcast done here in D.C. in the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I know with you we can speak about multiple matters, but I want to start speaking about a subject that I know is very close to your heart. Your father was born in South Africa. You also were a volunteer in Africa with your wife. You have been an ambassador in Tanzania. And there are very few people that know such amount of information and have so vast knowledge on Africa here in Washington, D.C. So let me begin by asking, how do you see the U.S. relationship with Africa today, and what do you think should be done in the course of the next 5 years, considering two elements? One, Africa is going to be definitive for climate action. Yeah. And also, there's going to be a tremendous pressure in Africa due to climate migration, but also there's an immense need of resources so that countries can increase the level of income and reduce the poverty gap.
Well, so first off, you're right. Africa's in my blood. I was actually baptized on a farm in Africa a very long time ago. So Africa is the youngest continent. It's a continent that is key in so many ways to the world's future. I worry a fair bit in that I'm not sure that U.S. policy, quite frankly, is reaching out and treating the young people on the continent the way they want to be treated, want to be listened to. So first off, young people are the same everywhere in the world. They want an opportunity. They don't want anything given to them other than a chance to lead themselves, to be able to raise a family and create opportunities for their own kids. And I worry sometimes that our policies don't take that into account. I've often said that the problem with the way the West treats Africa, we treat Africans like they're hopeless and helpless instead of who they are, young people just looking for a taste of freedom, opportunity, those things that I think we all too often take for granted. So first off, I think it's essential that we do a better job of just listening. I often get a phone call when a U.S. leader is traveling to Africa. And first off, I remind them that it shouldn't be news. The engagements between the U.S., between the West and Africa should be so common, so everyday, so commonplace that they don't make news. They're simply part of a close working relationship. The first trip that the Chinese foreign minister takes every year for the last 31 years consecutively is to Africa. And yet, if a cabinet secretary from the U.S. goes to Africa, hits the front page of the New York Times and creates a stir. That has to change. Secondly, when we go to Africa, the first thing we need to do is just listen. Spend some time talking with African leaders, African young people, and say, what are your dreams? What are your hopes? What are your aspirations? Can we walk with you along the way? So you start that dialogue, and then you can get to matters like exploring a new energy future, exploring dealing with climate fallout, exploring ways to create a vibrancy in economic relations such that we can help incentivize that cleaner future, that more sustainable, greener future. But we're not doing that. I think we spend a lot of time finger wagging. I think we tend to look at African leaders on the climate and say, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't do that. And they look and they say, okay, well, now that you've screwed up the future, you in the West, in terms of choices that you've made, now you're telling us what to do. Instead of looking and saying, look, we need to help the world with new energy sources, with sustainable investments, with preserving and protecting biodiversity. It's in everyone's interest. We want to walk with you along the way. You should steer, but we'll help you get there. So those are the things I think we need to do. The other piece to it is how do we deal with Chinese investment and external debt in Africa? I think, again, instead of finger wagging, what we should demand is transparency. What we should say is, look, every dollar that we, the West, spends in Africa, we should make available for everyone to see, so that it is very clear we're working constructively in our engagement. But what happens with Chinese investment, it's opaque. No one knows where those investments go. And young people in Africa are not aware that their birthrights being collateralized. Every African has a birthright for the natural bounty of the resources that are there. In this day and age, I guess most notably critical minerals, but also the biodiversity, the vast natural treasures that are there, wildlife. And what they don't realize is that's getting borrowed against, quite frankly, and collateralized. And if we're not careful, if we don't all have eyes open, I worry about it slipping away. And that would be a terrible tragedy. Again, it robs young Africans of their birthright, and I think would be a loss to the world.
And there's something that also worries me, and it has to do with institutions, democracies, the weakness sometimes of governments. We have seen in the last year maybe more coup d'etats in Africa than we have seen maybe in the last decade. And it's also a reality that even sometimes they're democratic regimes. They basically are elected in a democracy, but then they become a dictocracy, and they can move into very authoritarian regimes. How do you see the current situation of democratic institutions in Africa? And do you believe that there's a hope and a possibility to strengthen democracy and guarantee that the transition in power is something that becomes more common and not less common as it has been now the case for at least in the last decade?
Yeah. So actually, in some ways, it relates to your first question. So I think there's enormous pressure in many parts of Africa, particularly in the Sahel and West Africa. We see shrinking available land for traditional agribusiness. And that's really putting pressures on the populace in ways that are creating, people are becoming unsettled in a lot of ways. So those pressures, I think, are creating opportunities for more autocratic leaders to seize the moment and undermine democracy and the progress that's been made. I think the key is that in our democracy work, we really need to go down to community level and village level and help to strengthen those institutions that listen to the voices, particularly of young people, because it is such a young continent. And secondly, we shouldn't use the term democracy as a club to beat people over the head. We need to do a better job of defining what it is that we mean. What we really mean is citizen-centered, citizen-responsive governance and institutions. We are looking to help foster institutions that listen to people and help them meet their needs. When you talk about it in those terms, everybody nods their head and says, yeah, that's exactly what it is that we want. I think what's happened is that we've allowed that term to be used in ways that appear to be preaching. I think we also need to talk with African leaders with a sense of humility. When I served as ambassador in Tanzania, I was lucky. Jakaya Kikwete of Tanzania became a good friend. He was the president at the time, and he was a great partner for doing so many things together. I used to always begin my speeches there when it comes to democracy and governance. And I would say, look, I'm not saying in the U.S. we have all the answers. What I am saying is we've probably made all the mistakes in our history. And as our friends, you don't have to make the mistakes that we've made. This is what we've learned the hard way, that elections matter, that responsive governance matters. And I always found that when you approach it like that and say, look, we've made a lot of things, mistakes, we've gotten a lot of things wrong, we're learning, you can stand on our shoulder. In fact, you can leapfrog us in responsive governance. And again, I think when you approach it like that, people say, yeah, okay, that works. We have a journey to be on together, and they're willing to listen, and they don't pretend to have all the answers. So I think that posture is extremely important in looking at it. I think also we have to recognize that in so many ways, it's not the failure of democratic institutions or democracy, it's that democracy is under attack, right? This is, in some cases, outside influence. When you look at the Sahel, a lot of the conflicts are driven by authoritarian forces like the Wagner Group, which I guess technically doesn't exist anymore, but those people haven't gone anywhere. They're still working to undermine. And also they're being flooded by weapons, which takes community disputes and makes them explosive. So I think those are all factors that we need to be aware of, and we need to make sure that we're countering and investing in institutions.
You mentioned something about the way that we should see Africa, and let's talk about the strategic value of the African continent. So I'll mention maybe 3 things that are in my radar. One is that negative use of land and deforestation have become the second largest source of greenhouse gases emissions globally. If it were a country, it'll be the second largest emitter, and it has become the largest source of emissions in the case of Africa. And while many people believe that Africa is in the 4 to 5% of global greenhouse gases emissions, the fact is that if you account negative use of land, it'll be around 10%, which puts Africa closer to the amount of emissions in Europe. So if we consider that, we have to acknowledge that Africa needs to invest almost $2.8 trillion in order to meet their decarbonization targets, better known as national determined contributions towards 2030. And those resources are not going to come easily from bilateral donors, from budgetary allocations, because they're highly indebted in the vast majority of countries. So they are looking for market solutions. And that's where the carbon credit plays an important role. I'm also a member of the steering committee of the African Carbon Markets Initiative. And what the market is looking for is to have more projects very well prepared, very well certified, very well verified, so that they can massively move resources that will be invested in Africa. Institutions are needed.
Yep.
From your own experience as an ambassador, and also from your experience of heading the largest development support or humanitarian or nation building agency in the world like USAID, what do you think should be the focus, and how can the U.S. contribute to accelerate resources that will come to the market to finance those projects that will create a green economy, reduce emissions, and put Africa in a much better place in terms of climate action?
Boy, and you put your finger on the most important set of issues that I think is facing not just Africa, but the world. So I think we have to begin by understanding what the economic needs of Africa are. Again, such a young continent. The World Bank projections of what it will take to actually create enough jobs, sustainable jobs, for the economies to grow and for young people to prosper is staggering. It's mind-blowing. The numbers are huge. So we can't get there, nor should we try to get there, in traditional government aid approaches. That's a bad idea. Never be enough money. Plus, it actually doesn't create the kinds of economic opportunity that needs to happen. What I think we need to do is to go country by country. Africa, there's a group here in D.C. that has a blog entitled "Africa is Not a Country," because we tend to treat all the Africans the same.
Of course.
And again, where I spent my time as a village teacher and Morocco look nothing like each other, obviously. It's going country by country and identifying those barriers to private investment. The biggest difference these days from my time as ambassador, and I served as ambassador 2006, or 2007, 2008, 2009. There was very little investment in Tanzania, American investment, other than safaris and hospitality. There was no manufacturing investment, no real private job-creating private investment. That's all changed. There are opportunities. The problem is in many of these countries, there's a lack of capacity, regulatory capacity, such that it's hard for African governments to respond to investment opportunities. By the time they go through the process to actually be able to process the proposals, clock runs out. And you'll see American investors saying, I can't lock up resources this long. I got other places we can go. So it's helping these governments to create the regulatory capacity such that they can be responsive to the opportunities that are there. Remember that private investment, U.S. private investment, we always talk about it being risk-taking. Not really. It's not terribly risk-taking. They need predictability, and we need to help them get that predictability, and that's building regulatory capacity in advance. We have to remember that in the case of Chinese investment, they don't need much in terms of time. They actually they try to create investment opportunities in Africa that cause those countries to be, quite frankly, subservient to Chinese interests. They want to lock up resources. We, on the other hand, want to find ways to help African leaders provide economic opportunities for their young people and have stronger governance in democratic institutions. So I think it's investing in the regulatory capacity in each of these countries, and the barriers are not the same everywhere. Positive developments. In my day, the notion of African governments working together to create broader markets would have almost been laughable. They were constantly at each other's throats, quite frankly. That's all changing. We're seeing African leaders come together behind a continent-wide free trade area. It does have a ways to go, but they're making real progress. That will break down some of the barriers between countries, and it'll break down some of the barriers to outside investment. And that's something very exciting. There are real possibilities that are there. So I think that's important. I think it's also building out the capacity of some of the regional organizations there. You have ECOWAS in West Africa. You've got SADC, which deals with Southern Africa and the East African community, helping to build their capacity to also break down boundary disputes and disputes between countries, so you can create those markets which actually create critical mass that's attractive to outside investment. I think all of those things are ways of getting at this, and also looking for ways to excite young people in opportunities. So traditionally, agribusiness jobs, economic opportunities around agriculture. They were not always the kinds of exciting opportunities, so they weren't portrayed that way, that would get young people reinvesting in sustainable agriculture for the future. That's all changed. The high-tech tools that are available, the SMM-based down to 1 acre weather forecasting, the use of drones for transportation, that's creating sustainable opportunities and exciting opportunities for young people. It captures their imagination, makes them part of the answer. When that happens, you'll see young people really acting in ways that create a brighter future environmentally, economically, and in terms of governance as well.
Mark, let me now switch topics.
Mm-hmm.
Let's continue on development. You were maybe one of the most important allies that I had when we were dealing with the Venezuelan migration crisis. I remember being with you in Cucuta. I remember being with you at one of the warehouses where we were storing a lot of the humanitarian aid that we were deploying. And I will always be thankful for your support when we decided to put together the temporary protection status to receive 1.8 million Venezuelans in Colombia, granting full rights for 10 years with the exception of political rights. And it became a very powerful policy that demonstrated that you can embrace with fraternity a migration crisis and also turn it into a very important economic opportunity. As it happened in Colombia, unemployment went down, informality went down, multidimensional poverty went down. So it was also a great experience for you as it was for me.
Yeah.
But let me also connect this with something that defines you politically. You have been a person who has been always recognized for being able to build consensus, to work with every different ways of thinking in Capitol Hill during your time in Congress. Out of that lesson that Colombia gave us in terms of dealing with fraternity with the migration crisis, let's talk about what do you think should be the future of a migration approach from the U.S. with Latin America, and something that I know you cheered for a lot, and you were also head of the McCain Institute. And if there was one politician that I always remember, his stubbornness in the positive way of trying to build a bipartisan migration comprehensive bill was him. Do you think that it's too optimistic today in the U.S.? Or how do you think the U.S. should approach these circumstances that are not going to stop, but could actually be much tougher in the coming years?
So, first off, you are too humble. The actions that you took with respect to TPS in Colombia, our mutual friend Filippo Grandi of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees referred to it as the greatest humanitarian gesture, certainly in the Americas in modern times, and I think that's true. It did take courage. There was not much immediate return on investment in political terms. It took real leadership. So what I've always found in taking on these issues is, first off, you have to define what success looks like. You have to paint that picture that everybody can look and say, okay, this is where green wants to go, and people can deal with it in those terms. I think secondly, it's not getting caught up in the politics of the day, but instead emphasizing the humanity that is with all people, including those who are displaced, forcibly displaced. As you know, because we were together in Panama, we spent some time looking at the Venezuelan outmigration that's taking place right now, particularly that going through the Darien jungle. And when I went down there to take a look, I tried not to get caught up in all the politics getting thrown around, but help people to understand the humanity of these people who are coming through. Again, they didn't wake up one morning and said, okay, I think I'm going to travel through one of the worst places on the face of the earth because this is fun. They did it because they looked at what was happening in Venezuela and said, I have to go, I can't live like this. Secondly, it's remembering that in each of us is unlimited potential. And I look at the families that I encountered recently down in the Darien, and these are people with hopes and dreams and skills, and they want to be contributors. Right? That's all they want. They want to be able to contribute. And if we're smart, we'll find ways to help them contribute. It would be better if they can contribute at home, which means in a place like Venezuela, a different leader and a different form of government, but even in the other places from where they're coming. Nobody wants to leave their homes behind and take on this terrible journey, and we have to keep reminding people of that. You can, you can create as many barriers as you want to migration. It's still going to keep going as long as people are being victimized by tyrants, losing economic opportunity, having gangs, particularly narco gangs around them. Of course they're going to flee. You would flee and I would flee as well. It's recognizing that and looking for ways to unlock the potential that these people have in their hearts and in their minds. And that's always what I try to do. I'm also one of those that I don't like issues of humanity being turned into political clubs to beat each other over the head. This is about the future. This is about who we are and what it is that we stand for. I try to remind people that we have seen leaders like Ronald Reagan talking about unlimited opportunity. So we tried to build the policies around that. You made reference to how we got to know each other. Part of it was because in the first conversation we had, I realized that we shared a point of view in terms of trying to help people wherever they are have a chance at what we in the U.S. call the American dream. It's not the American dream, right? It's the universal dream that we all have. Anything that advances that dream is good, and anything that gets in the way of that dream we have to take apart. And if we refer to it in those terms, it's not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's not conservative, it's not liberal. It's human, right? It's what we believe in and what we stand for.
Mark, when we think on Latin America, obviously migration is an issue that requires bipartisanship, that it requires to be a bicameral issue in the U.S. But there are beautiful success stories. One of those stories in terms of bipartisan policy was Plan Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
Started in the Pastrana administration, moved to the Uribe administration, continued in some way with the Santos administration, and it also helped us in my administration. And you were a champion of Plan Colombia at the time. But Plan Colombia, by its own merits, was not enough. And I have to recognize that maybe the boldest policy that we have seen in the last 4 decades from the U.S. with Latin America was led by President George W. Bush when he championed for the free trade agreements with Central America, with the DR, with Colombia, with Peru, with Chile. I mean, he really demonstrated that trade triggers growth, triggers investment, triggers opportunity. It has long-term stability. And because of the help of people like you when you were a member of Congress, we also had the support of people from both parties. And it became one of the most important success stories of U.S. foreign and development policy. But the way I've seen things move in the last years is like it's almost impossible to open a calm conversation about trade in Capitol Hill just because it's too political, it's too polarizing in many states. But I think if there's something that really can reemphasize the U.S. relationship with the whole Western Hemisphere is trade. I saw, for example, Ecuador wanting to build a free trade agreement. They never got a response during President Lazo's term, and they signed a free trade agreement with China. Now I see this week Colombia signing the Belt and Road Initiative, although we have a free trade agreement with the U.S. So what can be done in order to bring back bipartisanship and bicameralism when it comes to see trade, not as something that takes jobs away from the American citizens, but instead that improves the markets for the U.S. in the Western Hemisphere, but it's also a win-win because it opened long-term opportunities for developing countries?
You've noted I'm an optimist by nature. It's on the trade front, I'm clear-eyed and concerned when I look at the lack of emphasis on trade here in Washington. So the other piece to it, as the development guy, I always tell people, what we try to say to the world is, look, we want you to go from being aid recipients to partners to, in a perfect world, fellow donors. You can't get there if you don't have vibrant trade. You cannot complete that journey. And so I think we're making a terrible mistake when we retreat from trade, expanded trade, and it is worrisome to me. We'll say, I think there is a greater constituency for trade in Washington, in Congress, than I think people realize. And you've seen this, but sometimes in politics, in polling, when you go to survey and ask someone will say, well, yeah, I support it, but my neighbor never will. And pretty soon you go around and around, you can't figure out who it is that actually opposes it. And I've talked to a number of my Democratic friends who will say, look, I support trade, and I think there's a greater level of support for it than the Biden White House realizes. So I think that's true. I think we have to get away from some of the terminology we've used maybe, and instead talk about breaking down barriers to commerce and creating predictability. We have to have expanded trade. And it's not only economic, it's cultural, and it's political, and it's diplomatic. We join each other at the hip, right? We have a shared stake in the future. That's the way that we get there. We tend to talk about trade in win-lose, and that doesn't make sense. Economically, trade can help resources flow to where they can be used most effectively and efficiently. And if trade opens the door to investment in Colombia that creates consumers for U.S. products, we all win with smart trade. I think we will get back there, but we're in a moment in which everybody's afraid to talk about it. We'll see what happens with the next U.S. administration. I am worried because I think that if we don't offer trade, then that does open the door for the Chinese model of investment. And what we don't realize, that is often attractive to other countries, even though objectively speaking, it doesn't bring the returns that people are looking for. But you can't compete with that without something on our side. We need to get back at looking for ways for real trade, and again, binding each other at the hip. The business community is looking for it, but again, our partner countries are looking for it. So we have to get back to that discussion.
Mark, although I know we're running out of time, I want to be able to, based on what we have talked about Africa, Latin America, migration, trade, talk about the Woodrow Wilson Center and the transformation that you have built in the center in order to be every day more influential, to persuade more policymakers on specific things that need to occur in different parts of the world. And the center has a great number of scholars, has also a specific knowledge on different parts of the world. But I just want to ask you, what do you consider from the Woodrow Wilson's perspective, Woodrow Wilson Center's perspective, the three more critical geopolitical issues the U.S. should give attention in the next administration, whoever wins?
Mm-hmm. Well, one we've just touched upon. I think we have to take a look at free enterprise, commerce, and trade. It's crucial to the role that the West plays in economic statecraft. And so we're looking for ways to elevate that. Secondly, we have to bring back constructive disagreement in foreign policy. One of the things that I saw with John McCain and Madeleine Albright, so McCain, in my days with the International Republican Institute, McCain chaired the board, and our sister organization, the National Democratic Institute, Madeleine Albright chaired that board. And I remember watching them in events together, and they disagreed on most things, but they did so in wonderfully charming, constructive ways. Constructive disagreement in which we can talk about America's role in the world. We may have differences and distinctions around the edges, but constantly looking for ways to model how we formulate foreign policy, but also bringing back a vibrancy in how we construct foreign policy. I think that's absolutely crucial. So that's the other piece that I would focus on. You mentioned with Wilson. So what's unusual about the Woodrow Wilson Center, we're what's called a U.S. trust instrumentality. Technically, we're part of the government, part of the Smithsonian, which means that we are fiercely nonpartisan and independent. I've, as we would say, bet the farm that there is a market for unbiased, nonpartisan policy formulation. I hope I'm right. I mean, that's what I've bet everything on. We have to have institutions where we can get together in public and also behind closed doors, have disagreements, be an incubator for good ideas in foreign policy. That, to me, is where the future is. I believe in the power of ideas. We have to get out of a mode in which anybody putting forward an idea is immediately pounced upon and attacked by one side or the other. That's what we're hoping to do at the Woodrow Wilson Center. It's what we're trying to do. And quite frankly, that's the contribution that you're making, bringing here, is bringing perspectives from Latin America. That's helpful to us because that engagement is how we get to the right place.
Mark, let me ask you the last question. And I'm going to move to a very different topic. You've exercised leadership in multiple ways: Congress, in foreign policy, think tanks. You lead one of the most prestigious institutions in Washington. But I know you're an American football fan, and you are a fan of the Green Bay Packers. I will go to Green Bay with you pretty soon. But I just want to ask you, the Packers have this great legend, the Lombardi times, and there's like a mystic thing behind the Packers. But what are the lessons that you have taken from American football and from the Packers itself in your own exercise of leadership?
So, I'm from Green Bay, and at one time lived next door to Marguerite Lambeau, Curly Lambeau of Lambeau Field, Curly's widow, and had the chance to get to know Bart Starr from the 60s, Reggie White from the 2000s, from the 1990s. What always impressed me is that the Green Bay Packers use blue-collar values to achieve greatness. Vince Lombardi, the famous Vince Lombardi, was a pretty humble guy. Interestingly, Lombardi was one of the most progressive people on civil rights among any leader. Why? Because he was, as he put it, a dark-skinned Italian, Catholic, devout Catholic, and Green Bay is a pretty Catholic area. And when he came to Green Bay, he would tell people that as a little boy growing up, he remembers discrimination against Catholics, and again, he said dark-skinned Italians. So, he actually brought those values. So the Packers were way ahead of the curve on civil rights in the 1960s, and the way he treated people from different backgrounds. I think those blue-collar conservative values, which I believe in with all of my heart, that you can actually achieve greatness. We live in a time where sports are big money, right? Very flashy, celebrities, fancy. I hope there's still a place for blue-collar values. One thing is, Green Bay actually owns the Packers. It's unique in American professional sports. I have a share. I have a certificate of stock ownership. It gives me precisely nothing, except I get to tell everybody.
Joy.
Well, there's you get bumper stickers in Green Bay that say part owner Green Bay Packers, right? So no, it's a fun thing. My late father, my South African father, it's what we shared. Watching those games on Sundays, yelling at the TV and all of that. I remember it. I remember it well. So good values and small town. When I was sworn in as ambassador, I did something very unusual. I wasn't sworn in here in Washington, D.C. I wasn't sworn in at the State Department. I was sworn in on a farm just outside Green Bay. And what I said to everybody is, look, the reason I'm doing this is what you see around you. Those are the values I hope to bring to American foreign policy, because it's good stuff, right? It is hard work, faith, family, belief in freedom. So, that's what that's what I grew up with, and Green Bay's always going to be my home.
Nice. And let me just
we will win. And so we have to bring a victory to
so
the
we'll
Green Bay
become a
Packers.
Packers fan then. Yeah. I have to ask you something, just because listening to you and knowing that you have worked and you've dealt with many presidents of the United States. Can you share one lesson that you've gotten from those presidents that you've been able to interact? Clinton, you know him very well when you were in Congress. George W. Bush were in Congress, but you also were his ambassador. You worked with President Obama, you worked with President Trump, and you've also worked with President Biden. A small, brief lesson that you've gotten from each one of them?
Well, so how difficult the job is. I will say, President Bush I was closest to. I was his ambassador. And what always struck me with President Bush, he visited me in Tanzania. And I took him, he's the author of the AIDS initiative, PEPFAR as it is known. I took him to an AIDS clinic in Tanzania. And I will never forget his reaction in meeting a young mother who was HIV positive with a babe on her shoulder. And it brought tears to his eyes. And as we were driving away, I remember later in the day some of the Tanzanians coming and seeing tears in his eyes and said, "Is everything okay? Did something bad happen? Did we do something wrong?" And I said, "No. What is amazing about presidents, they see papers, they see numbers, they see statistics, they get people briefing them all the time. It's helping them to see the humanity and the implications of what it is that they do. It is helping U.S. leaders to see the positives out of Plan Colombia and Peace Colombia, and realizing that for those farmers who are looking for a legal opportunity to raise their kids and have economic opportunity, that's what it's all about. We need to stop isolating presidents and making them sort of the prisoners of their briefings. Get people out. Get them out to see the world and to see people where they live and where they work. To me, that's the key. I've got to believe that when they see the things that you have seen, the things that I have seen, they'll reach some of the same conclusions. I'm a profound optimist. I see in each human being unlimited opportunity. Goodness, right? And we've got to tap into that. Stop treating people with political labels, stop treating people with numbers, and instead realizing that we all want the same thing. I started off my career in foreign policy as a teacher in a village in Kenya. And what struck me was how desperate those kids were to go to school, to have an opportunity to do the things that I mean, you and I take for granted, let's face it. If you can tap into that, if you can harness that, then then humanity is lifted up. And that sure, we're going to have our disagreements, but that's how you build consensus. That's how you build that path forward to a brighter dawn.
Mark, it's always a pleasure to talk with you, and so I look forward to go to Green Bay with you, and we want you to come back to Colombia pretty soon.
Oh,
thank you so much, and what an amazing conversation.
Well, thank you very much. Great pleasure, as always.
Great pleasure.